but I would like to have a brief stand-up meeting 2 Sundays from now. I'll mention it again next week. I think it's October 2nd. Just a brief stand-up meeting with I guess anyone at the table that is kind of seen as the self-designated or self-appointed leader. I just want to chat with you for just a few minutes. And so I'll remind you again next week, but it's 2 weeks from today, right after class, just for a few minutes as we move ahead. Okay. Reminding you of the Holy Land Bible Land Discovery Trip. There are brochures on the table. The video I wanted to show you is one that I had put together. It's fabulous, but I'll do that after class for you. Tom, where are we, buddy? Huh? I'm live? Hey, sorry. Thanks for joining me. Okay. A long time ago, and I know you'll not be offended by that. If you are, you probably won't watch again. But I'm delighted that you're watching live or you're watching on up later on an archive. But my heart has always been to make sure that I take care, first and foremost, those people who are sitting in the room live. Okay, so you kind of get in on what we're doing, and we're glad. But I cater more to them than I do you. I hope that's not offensive to you. If it is, you probably won't come back. All right, but I hope you're enjoying it. Okay. Hey, listen. Open your Bibles to Psalm 42. Psalm 42. We're in a series. Big problems, bigger God. Big problems, bigger God. And we've looked at a lot of problems. Today will be number 18. I'm just thinking, we've looked at doubt. We've looked at lying, hypocrisy. We've looked at a failure, 2 lessons on failure, jealousy, prejudice, and others we have looked at over these past several months. What began at least in my heart and mind, is maybe 8 or 10 lessons, has moved its way. Today will be 18, and there will be 2 more after today. 2 more after today, but we'll do part 18 in just a few minutes. And there's been a theme to this all the way through. Look at this next slide. That no problem. Again, we all face them. The only way to eliminate your life of problems is to go to heaven. Okay, as long as you and I are living in a fallen human world and we're fallen, sinful human beings, as much as we're striving to grow in our relationship with Christ, we're going to have problems. We're going to have issues. It's just the nature of things. And I'm not sure as we move a little bit more into the end time drama that those problems are not going to be more related to our willingness to follow for Christ and stand up for Christ than they have been in the past. For us, and I hope we'll be strong and courageous in doing that. In fact, that's probably one of the probably the main message in that movie that came out Friday, Running the Bases, about the willingness to stand up for your faith, regardless of the potential sacrifice that it may demand from you. So it was a really powerful movie. But the key thought is no problem is too big. No problem is too big. That God is not bigger. Today, we're going to look at the problem of, I'll call it despair. I don't think I'll ask you to raise your hand, but I will ask you the question. Who knows someone that have struggled, at least to some degree, a lot of words I could use here, with despair, anxiety disorder of some time, maybe extremely stressed and burned out, and perhaps even I'll use the depression word. When I ask you that question, do some people come to your mind that the answer is probably yes to that. Mental health in our country has frankly been, poor mental health has probably been on the rise for the last 10 to 15 years, and COVID and all went with that, didn't help and worsened matters. And with the tremendous influx of illegal drugs that have come into the nation and the accessibility of those drugs has further made it easier for people who are struggling to cope with life, you might say, to find some sense of at least momentary peace through a false high. And but the deaths, I don't know what they are, but they're among the thousands of young men and women and older men and women who are passing away from fentanyl and other substance abuse programs. Alcoholism has never been. All of these are, well, at least most of these are many times efforts to escape from a deep, dark hole and cave, as we'll talk about today. Here are some statistics that are quite frightening. I just used the term despair or anxiety disorders, but over 40 million a year experience that to some degree. Over 40 million, that's almost 20% of our population. And again, you got to remember, we only know those numbers because of the willingness of some people to report themselves, as it were, to their own physicians or what have you. And you and I know that many people never tell anyone. It's just the people that they love. They watch them live with it. So I do know this, that number 18, okay, is the lowest possible number. It could be twice that. I don't know. I do know this, and I guess you reach a place that transparency is important, and hiding things doing good, it might be helpful. I know that I struggled with I don't know that I would use the term depression, but anxiety, and because I'm a perfectionist, and you never can live up to that standard. And so you struggle with failure. And so there have been seasons in my journey over the last 40 years where I was on antidepressant medication for a number of months or years, on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off, off now. But I don't have any compulsion. If that dark cave appears again, I don't mind going to get help. Beyond myself and beyond my friend. 17 million, I'm sorry about this 18 point, that should be 18 to 25. Strikingly, with so much to live for, the group that is most susceptible today to the anxiety disorders and depression and despair are the young adults. 18 to 25 years of age, some 17 million of those. Here's what scares me. Almost half never seek help. There's got to be some sort of stigma that prevents us from going to get help. My experience tells me that stigma is more often related in the faith community than in the non-faith community. We're just, of all the places where we should be most comfortable to talk about ourselves and to get help and encouragement, support, and prayer from others, unfortunately, the church and its people sometimes are the least likely place to go and to get help. And that's sad. It's true. But it's sad, and sometimes the cave, the despair, that sense of hopelessness can become so great that you reach the point that you feel like the only way out for you is that you take your life. Sometimes nowadays with the fentanyl and other drugs, it's more accidental, but sometimes it's on purpose, either the drug side or whether it's self-inflicted wound. And as the mental health has deteriorated and the statistics rise, we can imagine that has also led to some increase in what's happening in terms of suicide. To kind of give you an idea on that, but there are about 50, this is America, just America. There are about 50,000 suicides a year. That's about 135 a day. That's about 6 in this hour. About 6. That doesn't hold a candle to the thousands upon thousands of folks who attempt it and fail. 60% of us know someone who committed suicide. Could have been a coworker, could have been a friend, could have been somebody that we had known presently or in the past. But 20% of us, that's 1 in 5. Ever since Jeremy died of suicide, there's never been a time that I ever stood up on the platform to preach that I didn't realize out there among the hundreds of people in 3 services that I could look down and I see all these seats and remember that about every 5th person, they had a mom, a dad, a brother, a sister, a grandmom, a granddad, somebody in their immediate family that has taken their life. So though we never talk about it, okay, it is close to home for all of us. So it just gives, again, some insight to the despair and the sense of hopelessness that's taking place. This month, I thought this was ironic, but part of God's plan. September is Suicide Awareness Month. Declared nationally. So it's I guess it's the way God would have it for that to come up in our time together. So I want you to look with me. We're going to do Psalm 142. I'm going to read through this. I've got it on the screen. I don't usually do that, but it's a short psalm. It's only 7 verses. But I've got highlighted because I know by my own personal experience, when life begins to close in, the anxiety and the stress and the burnout and the worry and the fear and all that begins to mount. We all have our caves, our holes that we tend to run into. I did, and hoping no one would discover us. But everything about life, when you move into one of these seasons, is everything's pointed inward. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. I'm just saying it's true. We just kind of are looking at ourselves and feeling poorly about ourselves. David, I'll get into this. David wrote this psalm, but this is the same David that wrote the psalm that we talked about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Psalm 139, about our identity in Christ. So that tells me that all of us at times, sometimes we can feel pretty good about ourselves, that God may be created His image and He loves me unconditionally and so on. And then sometimes the hole can get so dark. Maybe we're not even sure that God's there anymore. And we have this tremendous swing in what's going on with us emotionally. So this is, again, David. I'll give you some context in just a minute, because the context in this psalm really, really matters in terms of what's going on. But you'll see all of these personal pronouns that are highlighted in green here as David pours out his heart to God in a very troubled time in his journey. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. This is what David writes. With my voice, I cry out to the Lord. With my voice, I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before Him. I tell my trouble before Him. When my spirit faints within me, You know my way. In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see. There is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. I cry to You, O Lord. I say, You are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison, that I may give thanks to Your name. The righteous will surround me, for You will deal bountifully with me. Just kind of pours out his soul. If you have a Bible, and if you look at Psalm 142, And I don't know if it would be on your device. Hopefully it would be. But many of the Psalms are introduced by what's called a title or a superscription. Basically, sometimes telling you who wrote it and telling you what the context was in which it was written. So to give you a little bit of a backdrop there. In Psalm 142, it says a maskil, we'll talk about that, of David when he was in the cave, a prayer. So let me kind of, that's a little bit longer than normal, as it were, title or superscription, but there's a wealth of important information. This term, it's a maskil, that's only ascribed about 13 Psalms out of all of the 150 Psalms that we have in our scripture. And it describes Psalms with a particular purpose to provide insight and instruction. In this case, specific insight and instruction on how to handle despair, discouragement, anxiety, excessive stress, burnout, and depression. This is someone who has experienced it and who came out of it, and can tell us from his own personal experience, this is what happened to me, and it was very real. I'd been brought very low in my life, but I finally came out of it. In time, more or less, kind of this too will pass. So this is a voice of experience, which in my word, people are always offering advice, but I tend to listen to the people who've been there and done that. They tend to have a wisdom to them that those who speak out of non-experience don't have. Okay, when I was a student pastor, when I was in my 20s and early 30s, and we had small children, I knew everything about teenagers, and then mine became teenagers. Okay, and an alien entered their lives and their mind and possessed them for 7 to 10 years. Okay, and I wonder sometimes if they're not still possessed, but that's a whole different thing. Okay, and it's of David. David, we're familiar with David. Almost half of the 150 Psalms David wrote, and David really pouring out his heart. And we all know David's story. Chosen to be king as a young lad and ascended eventually to the king, though that took almost 20 years for him to get there after he was anointed to be king. But his life, though he was a tremendous king in many ways, his life was not easy, much because of some poor decisions that he made that affected himself and his family and his dynasty as well. But where I want to focus for a minute is when he was in the cave. When he was in the cave. This is Psalm 142. There are only 2 times in Scripture that we have recorded where David finds himself in a cave. Usually they're hiding, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by his 400 men that were with him and supportive of him. The one is at a cave in En-Gedi, which 1 Samuel chapter 24 talks about, and Psalm 34. Let me turn back to Psalm 34. Just again, I'm trying to give you some context. Here's the superscription, the title of Psalm 34, a Psalm of David when he pretended or feigned madness before Abimelech. That was kind of a title for a king in the Philistine area, kind of like Caesar would be in Rome or Pharaoh would be Egypt. It was just kind of a title given there, so that he drove him out and he went away. So this was in the context of something that happened for him. And then in Psalm 57, just kind of one more, Psalm 57. The superscription is to the choir master, according to do not destroy, a miktam. I'm not sure what a miktam means. There are only a handful, I think 6 Psalms that have that. It's some kind of a teaching lesson, but it's not clear what that Hebrew term means. When he fled from Saul in the cave. When he fled from Saul in the cave. Now, go back with me to 1 Samuel chapter 21. 1 Samuel 21. This is the context of what David, where David was when he writes this Psalm and Psalm 34. Okay, I'm just going to read a few verses here to give you a little bit of the context, but having read the superscriptions for Psalm 34 and 142, and David rose and fled that day from Saul. David was probably anointed to be king as a young teenager when he was a shepherd boy. Somewhere, we don't know exactly for sure. I'm guessing late teens, early 20s at the latest. He ends up kind of the sweet singer of Israel, the writer of Psalms, playing the harp for King Saul. And David began slays Goliath, and his notoriety, he becomes popular. Saul becomes intensely jealous and angry and murderous. And there's a season in here. Just imagine you're 18, 19, 20 years of age, has a huge family, and he spends somewhere between 7 and 10 years on the run for his life from Saul, who had access to thousands of military and army. Just kind of picture that in your mind. That's the David. That's kind of what's going on here. And David fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Abimelech was the dynasty name, kind of like, again, Caesar and Pharaoh, but his name was Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to the one another of him in dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart and was much afraid. He was afraid they were going to kill him. Okay? So he changed his behavior before them, the king and all of his court, and feigned himself mad, pretended to be crazy. Because who kills a crazy person? Okay? So he pretends himself to be mad in their hands, and he made marks on the doors of the gates, and he let his spittle run down his beard. I mean, anything I could do to... I don't want these people to kill me, so I'll just pretend that I'm crazy. And most of the time, we're afraid of crazy people. Okay, and they will let me go, which is exactly what happened to him. And he goes on here in verse, "Lo, you see a man who is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen?" In other words, I got enough crazies in my own kingdom. I don't need visitors adding to the craziness of my kingdom, much less somebody supposed to become king of an enemy. "Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" The answer is no. That's the backdrop of Psalm 34 being written. Now I'm going to read on. Verse 1. David departed from there. They let him go and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Not in Gedi. That was Psalm 57. This is Adullam, probably 2 years earlier than what's taking place in Gedi. And when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, again, he has a huge family, he's on the run, they went down to him. And everyone was in distress. That's a very interesting, I'll unpack that in a minute. And not only was everyone in distress, everyone was in debt. It doesn't mean financial debt, but I'll explain that in a minute. And everyone was discontented. Okay, well, let me go. They gathered to him, and he became captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. It's bad enough to be depressed in the cave alone, but to have 400 more show up who are in distress means all stressed out and troubled, in debt, totally deceived about what's going on and what's happening and what isn't. They are discontented, they are bitter, they're angry for the situation that David and that they are in. And you know, I love to lead, and I like it when people recognize and I guess choose to be the leader. But this is a group that I wouldn't, if I were David, you know what, don't make me leader. I don't want to be the leader of over 400 depressed, burned out, overly stressed, discontented, deceived malcontents. But they made him captain of it. Okay. I really think I want to go deeper in the cave, further back. Okay. It was bad before. Now I've got another 400 singing the woes and the blues. I mean, can things possibly, as it were, get any worse? And then he writes that psalm, and it's just 7 verses. And I had highlighted the personal pronouns that are in there, and I'm sure you didn't, but there are 29 of them in 7 verses. I 9 times, me 9 times, and my 11 times. Because that's exactly where we go when life gets dark. It becomes all about I and all about me, and total despair, and an elected leader of a bunch of malcontents. And then the last couple of words of this title, it's a Maskell. It's got something specific to teach us by somebody who's been there. David is the person in the cave at Adullam, and it is a prayer. This whole thing is a prayer, as David cries out to God in his distress and torment and discontentment, despair, anxiety, depression. Charles Spurgeon said, caves make good closets for prayer. And we all have caves somewhere. All have. What's interesting, again, this is a prayer, and but in my own personal experience of struggling with some depression issues off and on, even as a person of great faith and growing, I often, maybe always, found myself going to God in prayer, not my first choice, but my last chance. I don't know if it's because I felt like such a failure with Him that I was embarrassed to go to Him. I don't know what my thinking was. Listen, when you get in this kind of a hole, you don't think straight. You think you're thinking straight, but you don't. And you all rationalize all sorts of irrational behavior. And it's a tough place. There's no question about it. So now we come to just the psalm, and we're talking about the problem of despair. And I'm just going to kind of unpack. It's only 7 verses, and walk through I divided it into 4 sections in this psalm. And the first one has to do with despair, depression, anxiety, whatever you want to call it. Listen to what David says. He says, "With my voice," by the way, he uses that twice. My voice, I cry. It's hard. The Hebrew language is compared to the Greek in the New Testament, is a very visual, graphic, full of imagery language that's hard to be transliterated and translated into English. It kind of loses some of its imagery and power. Well, this word here that we have in English, I cry, means I groan, I shriek, I scream in agony of my soul. You don't get that in just I cry out, just in agony. I'm at the end of my rope. I don't know how much longer I can go on. This crazy king has been chasing me for years, and he got one goal in mind, and that's to kill me. And now I've got to lead these 400 people who are as lost as I am. And I'm not sure how much longer I can go on. With my voice, I plead for mercy. I plead for God's favor, for God to make Himself known to me again. I feel so isolated and abandoned. To the Lord, twice to the Lord, twice crying out to Him. Verse 2, I pour out, I spill out, I spew out my complaint before Him. That has to do with all of this turmoil that's going on inside of Him. That's going in terms of the stress and the anxiety and the concern. And now he's got all this concern over him, and now he's responsible for 400 other people. It's not just him that's at stake. It's these lives of the other 400. And I tell my trouble. Trouble has to do with the external circumstances that were going on with Saul chasing him. They're hiding out in the in the cave. And yet in this opening, David says, I cry out to the Lord. I plead for mercy to the Lord. I take my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. Why is in God's omniscience knowing us perfectly? Why is he is always the first to know, but often he's the last one we go to? I mean, is David telling God anything he doesn't know? I mean, is God sitting in heaven and David's pouring out his heart and say, oh, David, I'm so sorry, I missed that. No. And neither for us. He's never caught by surprise. He always knows. Now we can get into, well, why does he let that happen? Why does he go? Well, I don't know that we'll always know the answer, but generally speaking, it usually goes back to us and not him. And sometimes this intense stress and anxiety comes because of people that we know and love make decisions that hurt them and us, and we end up on the receiving end of those negative emotions as a result of it. So David is just in absolute despair. But I tell you what he does, and eventually I got there. Every time I went through this season, eventually I got there. Yeah, I groveled and hid in the cave for a while, but eventually I got there when I really honestly opened my heart to the God who already knew everything about what was going on inside of me and outside of me and how I felt. He was there all the time, but I just didn't, I guess as it were, go to him. And again, we know the circumstances. I read those in 1 Samuel chapter 22. The second thing I want to talk about has to do with not just his despair, but I'll call it desperation, because there are two things that stick out in verses 3 and 4 that are almost always true when you and I are in despair. Let me read verse 3. When my spirit faints within me, when I am overwhelmed, when I'm just covered by the darkness, when I'm just kind of uncertain and disoriented, that means all of that. When everything I'm uncertain what to do. You know my way. Now, David didn't say you've caused all this or you're to blame for all this. It's just that you're aware of it, you know, and you care. And you have obviously allowed that to happen. In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. What's going on here is David is afraid. He's fearful. I'm sure for himself, but probably as a good leader, more fearful for those men that he is responsible for, and that was probably the primary emotion that I felt in those down seasons. Was I was afraid. For me, it was probably more being found. I was more afraid of being found out and disappointing people who thought and respected probably more of me than they should have. And so we all get pretty good at hiding our true selves. We do. We get experts at that. And I was afraid. I think I was afraid more of being found out than anything else. I did have a couple, not many, sensitive people, friends, close friends, co-workers that I don't know picked up and came to me privately and Jimmy, you okay? And I don't know what most other people do, but I know what I did. I lied. Yeah, I'm fine. things are just busy. A lot going on, and that was true, but it wasn't the real reasons. So David he was afraid, and it's a powerful emotion. And then not only that, look at verse 4. You look to the right and see, and there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. Fear, but afraid, but also alone. I'm in this cave. I've got all these people. I don't see any way out. And though I'm surrounded by 400 people, I'm all alone. I came to work every day surrounded by tens and dozens of people. I came to worship every Sunday surrounded by 1,000 people. But I felt so alone. So alone. I suspect that's how others felt as well. And felt nobody cared. Now, again, when you get into this deep, dark place that seems to be unending, and many of us have loved ones who have been there ourselves. You rationalize, but you're irrational. Nobody cares. It's just I'm all alone. Now, on the other side of it, you realize that there were a lot of people who genuinely cared had they known, but you're afraid to tell. So it's just a kind of a downward spiral. So when we move into verses 5 and 6, the perspective of David is going to begin to shift in a good direction as he kind of begins to look, as it were, to the mighty counselor, to his best friend, as Solomon said, one that sits closer than a brother, and he kind of finds God again. Look at verse 5. I cry to you, O Lord. I shriek, scream, and tremendous agony and pain. I say, but you are my refuge. You are my protector. Not the cave, not these men, but you. You are the one that's been here all the time. My portion, what I need the most very interesting, my portion in the land of the living. Hope is not found in taking your life. It just leaves behind you people with heartache that they live with the rest of their lives. It's the coward's way out. But when you're irrational, you make those decisions thinking, I'll finally have peace, and so will everybody else. I'll no longer be a bother. And you do what you think is rational, but is irrational, but irreversible. David, I don't know what he was thinking, but I do know in this land of the living, part of what he's saying is even in a cave, even in despair, perhaps depression, I'm better off alive than dead. I'd rather be in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, verse 6. For I am brought very low, depressed, discouraged, at the end of my rope. Attend to my cry. Deliver me from my persecutors. That would obviously be Saul and his thousands of people that were in pursuit of him, for they are too strong for me. I can't win this battle alone. I'm not sure I can win it with 400 mighty men. I think the only way I'm going to win this thing is to be convinced again that you are on my side and that you are with me, even in this cave of despair. Because David had opportunity. I didn't mention to you, but if we read over in chapter 24, 1 Samuel, the En-Gedi experience, you may recall, it's one of the humorous things, little sections in Scripture, where David and his men are hiding out in a cave. They're in the back of the cave. and Saul comes into the cave to relieve himself. Okay? And David makes his way up to him and cuts part of the hem off of his garment, only to later confront Saul and say, I could have killed you, but I didn't. I didn't. Now, that didn't change Saul. Saul was by now crazily insane and jealous of David and totally committed to his death. And then in verse 7, the last verse, is kind of the sense of perspective beginning to change, needing to have hope to go on, knowing that God was with him even in the valley, in the cave, as it were, of despair. So in verse 7, bring me out of my prison. Give me freedom. He wasn't literally in a prison, it was in a cave and what have you, but his perspective was he was all enslaved. For us, more often, it's more of a kind of a spiritual, emotional prison that we just don't see any key, any way to get out. That I may give thanks to your name and deliver. The righteous will surround me. Probably the biggest regret in the seasons of my journey that were in those times of desperation and discouragement was the unwillingness. You do have to be careful. You can't tell everybody everything. Some people are nothing but gossips and nothing but judgmental. So, you have to be careful. You do. But there's no doubt in my mind, looking back, there were a handful of men and women around me that I could told them anything, and they would have not judged me. And they would have loved me. And they would have been there for me. But I didn't give them that chance. And that was a mistake. Big mistake. Big mistake in my life. The righteous will surround me. And then he goes on to say, and you, God, you will. And it's really interesting. Twice he says, you will. Not that he hasn't in the past, not that he's doing it, but I just know that I've seen you do it in the past. I've seen you surround me with people there to support me. I've seen you be there for me in the past. Though I may not feel that right now in this cave, I know you will be again. I know that. And that's going to keep me moving forward in my life. And I love that phrase, that I may give thanks to your name. Lord, I want you to answer this prayer. This is a prayer. I want you to answer that, because I think if you answer it, it will redound more to your glory and to your honor. And I'm sure that's exactly what happened. So Psalm ends. Psalm ends. Where is David? He's still in the cave. He's still in the cave. We thought, got to step in. The cave's gone, nothing but sunshine. Not always. Not always. God is not promised to deliver us from the cave. Never. But he has promised to be with us in the cave. If we invite him in. David has been brought very, very low. So I've been brought very low. But now he's beginning to look up. Let me give you if our problems don't lead us to deeper faith and prayer, then we have missed the biggest lesson of the cave. We can get into this, well, why did it happen? And what did I do? And we can get into the why game forever. It never has a good ending. Stop it. Embrace the circumstances. Know that God has not abandoned you, that God is with you even though you don't feel His presence. And just know that He is faithful. And let a few selective others in that you can know and love and trust. Because from the cave, remember this, all 7 of these verses are a prayer. And there is never, I knew this intellectually and spiritually, I just didn't flesh it out. That there's no circumstance, no inner emotion, there's no cave ever too dark for God to shine. Ever. And He wants, I think, He wants to shine through us. Because I look back and I wonder how many lives could have been given hope and encouragement if I had been more transparent and honest early on, not worrying about being embarrassed, to let others know, like you, and so many of us, this anxiety and stress and depression is very real and doesn't respect Christians. And we've got to do a better job of feeling safe to talk to certain people about it, knowing that they will be there for us, even though they don't understand. There's a lot I've learned over the years in what I call the ministry of presence. Just being there. Just being there. Just being there. So, next, here are a few questions for discussion. What is the first thought that comes to your mind when you hear this word despair or depression? How safe do you feel in sharing your despair with others? When we struggle with despair, what could others do to support us? Okay. Next week, I'm going to do another problem. I think it is the greatest problem in the church today. I think it is the biggest scandal in the church today. And that is the problem of perpetual spiritual immaturity. Perpetual. Men and women, adults who have known Christ, not for days, weeks, months, but for many, many years, who are still not much further along in their journey than they were many years ago. Father, thank you for David and his honesty and transparency. This has been a soul searching time and preparation, teaching. I pray it'd be helpful, encouraging, because I know there are people in the room that are struggling with these same things occasionally, seasons of life. If not them, husbands, wives, children, parents, grandparents. Maybe this would give them a little bit of hope, maybe a little bit on how to help and how to pray for them. Bless now the time of discussion around these tables. Thank you for these dear people whom I love so much. In Jesus'